They will tell you that the Vethrak of Korath 7 killed 412 soldiers in 11 minutes and 40 seconds. That is what the file says. I know because I read it on my first shift, sitting in the nutrition station alcove on sublevel 9 of forward detention station, Saleg, eating a cold ration square out of a foil sleeve while the overhead strips buzzed their pale green light at me and the containment corridor stretched away toward the door marked K7 inches faded yellow stencil. I had come down on the sublevel elevator alone. The elevator had a sign on the inside of the door that read, Authorized Access Only Korath Wing, Sublevel 9. And below it, someone had scratched into the composite panel, in small, careful letters, the phrase, Good luck with that. I had read it and considered it. And then the elevator stopped, and the doors opened, and there was the corridor, and I stepped out. There was no one else on sublevel 9. There never was. The corridor ran 40 meters from the elevator bay to the far containment doors, lined with 6 alcoves, 3 on each side, and at the far end, set apart from the alcove bank and behind a secondary sealed access point, was K7. The floor was composite plate, non-slip, the same dull pewter gray as every other sub-level floor in the station. The walls were the same. The ceiling had 3 strip lighting banks, the left bank flickering in a slow, methodical way that suggested it had been doing this for some time and expected to continue for some time more. The door to K7 was visible even from the elevator bay. 2 meters of laminated containment-grade composite, framings of reinforced bonding material at each edge, a reinforced viewport at eye height with an opacity screen on the corridor side, and at the base, flush with the floor, the delivery pass-through slot. The door looked like it meant something. I took my tray from the nutrition supply station in Alcove 3, logged into the delivery terminal, and read the K7 file while the tray contents heated. My name is Naya Seld. I am 29 years old. I hold a Grade 2 nutrition certification from the Compact Welfare Division, and I have no background in behavioral science, xenobiology, predator handling, or anything the assessors would consider relevant to what I am now being asked to describe. I want the board to understand that from the beginning. I was there to deliver meals. That is the whole of my qualification. The file was 340 pages long, compiled across 91 years of compact custody, maintained by 11 successive behavioral science teams, and the first page opened was what the assessors called a classification summary, terminus grade containment required, single specimen, no observed social behavior, no response to handler contact, no identified communication modality, feeding by remote delivery, zero tolerance for corridor access during active behavioral state. The record of the original capture was 4 pages, heavily redacted, and the last line of the unredacted section read, Garrison Velen, 412 personnel. 11 minutes 40 seconds elapsed from point of containment breach to point of cessation. Do not attempt direct engagement. I remember reading that last line twice. The number sat in my chest in a particular way. 412, 11 minutes and 40 seconds. I tried to hold the arithmetic of it and failed. The way you fail to hold the arithmetic of distances in space, the number has weight, but no shape you can actually carry. Then I folded the file closed, finished my ration square, checked the delivery schedule for K7, loaded the tray protein slurry, supplemental mineral block. A canister of treated water slid into the pass-through slot at the base of the K7 door, and logged the delivery in the nutrition record. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I had scheduled a call with my sister on Wednesday and I was already thinking about what to tell her when she asked how the new posting was. Fine, I would say. Quiet. I had come to Korath Wing by accident. I want the board to understand that clearly, because several of the assessor's reports suggest I sought out the K7 assignment for reasons that were studied or deliberate. I didn't. I was a Grade 2 nutrition officer with a clean service record and no disciplinary notations, and when the scheduling coordinator at Central posted the sub-level 9 rotation, it was listed as an open slot because the previous officer had transferred out. I applied because it paid the same as the upper block rotation, and the upper block smelled of solvent. The coordinator confirmed my placement 4 days later without comment. I don't think she read the wing designation carefully. I won't pretend I wasn't frightened when I read the file. 412. 11 minutes. I sat with that for a long time on that first shift, working out the arithmetic of it against the thickness of the K7 door, the quality of the containment seals, the gauge of the reinforced pass-through slot. The engineering assessments in Section 12 of the file described the containment system as the most robust in compact custody history. I had no reason to disbelieve that. I decided that if the system had held for 91 years, it would hold through my shift. I decided that being frightened about it continuously for 12 hours was going to make for a very long 12 hours. So I stopped. Not all at once. It took about a week. But I stopped. The first week, it didn't eat. Not a delayed eating. Not eating when I left the corridor. It simply didn't touch the tray. I logged that in the nutrition record, and in the supplemental notes column, I wrote, "Delivery completed, contents undisturbed, specimen present." I wrote that because the file said to note behavioral anomalies in the supplemental column, and not eating when the previous entries showed consistent consumption seemed worth noting. On day 5, I flagged it to the Behavioral Science Office on Sub-Level 6, and a junior assessor named Torath came down to review the logs. He looked at my notes, looked at the delivery camera feed, and told me the Vethrak had done this before, periodically, and that I should continue standard delivery protocol and log anything unusual. I asked him what counted as unusual. He thought about it for a moment. He was a slight man with a distracted posture of someone who spent most of his time reading and was mildly uncomfortable when he had to stand upright and speak. "Anything outside of what the file describes," he said. I asked him to let me know if he had a more specific definition. He nodded and went back to sub-level 6, and I went back to the alcove and ate my ration square, and thought about the fact that the file described almost nothing, which meant almost everything was technically outside of it. On day 6, I slid the tray through and stood for a moment with my hand still on the handle of the pass-through, logging the time on my wrist unit. The K7 door was 2 meters of laminated containment-grade composite with a small reinforced viewport at eye height, the viewport covered by the opacity screen that could be cleared from the observation alcove terminal or from the doorside panel, which required a custody authorization code I had. I had not cleared it. I wasn't sure I wanted to. What I did instead was talk. Not to the Vethrak specifically. I wasn't certain it could hear through the door, but the engineering assessments in the file noted that the composite was acoustically dampening, as well as structurally robust, and I had no way of knowing how much sound reached the interior of the pod. I was aware that talking to classified containment specimens was probably not in the nutrition officer protocol, but I had always talked to myself during solitary work. It was a habit from a childhood in a house that was too quiet, and 12 hours on sub-level 9 with no one else in the corridor was, by any measure, solitary work. So I talked. I narrated what I was doing, logging the delivery, noting the mineral block position, checking the water canister seal. Sometimes I talked about other things. The call I was planning with my sister, who was 2 years younger than me and worked in the Outer Corridor Resettlement Administration and was deeply convinced that her job was more stressful than mine, which I had previously agreed with. The documentary I had watched on my rest day about glacial survey operations in the Outer Corridor systems, which I had found unexpectedly gripping. The strip light on the left bank of the ceiling in the corridor, which flickered in a slow, patient way that suggested maintenance had been told about it and was thinking it over. On day 7, the Vethrak 8, I logged it and wrote in the supplemental column, "Delivery completed. Contents consumed within standard window." I did not write anything about the talking. It seemed like a stretch to connect the two, and I was a nutrition officer, not a behavioral scientist. And I did not want to put something in the official record that would make me look like I was over-interpreting the eating habits of a terminus-grade classified containment specimen based on the hypothesis that it had responded to me, saying something about a documentary. By week 3, I had cleared the viewport. The file described the Vethrak as approximately 4 meters at the shoulder, 6-limbed, carapace-plated, in jade-black chitin, with compound amber eyes and 2 articulated mandible sets, flanking a central jaw structure. The compound eyes were documented as capable of independent targeting across a wide field, and the file noted they were highly sensitive to motion in the mid-range spectrum. The carapace covered the thorax and the leading edge of the abdomen. The underbelly was a softer amber-gray membrane, documented as the only viable vulnerability point in the original capture assessment. The 6 limbs were described in varying configurations, the forward 2 as primary manipulation appendages, the mid 2 as primary locomotion supports, the rear 2 as stabilization and secondary strike capability. Terminal claw structures on all 6 limbs, with the forward claw set documented as restraint capable. What the file did not describe, because I don't think any of the 11 successive behavioral science teams had spent much time standing at the viewport with the opacity screen cleared, was how the compound eyes caught the green of the corridor lighting. They were amber in the photographs, which had been taken under the pod's interior illumination. In the corridor, light filtered through the viewport composite. They came through as something closer to amber gold, layered and deep, the way compound eyes are deep when you're close enough to see the facets. They were very still. The Vethrak was still in a way that large things are rarely still not frozen, not waiting in a coiled sense, but resting with the kind of ease I associated with something that had nothing to fear and knew it. It occupied the rear 3/4 of the pod, which was large by engineering design. The assessment file noted the pod had been sized for a specimen considerably larger than the actual Vethrak, because the compact had not wanted to be wrong about the containment margins. The eyes came to the viewport when I cleared it. Not quickly, not with any apparent alarm or aggression. The head, large, low-slung, broad across the articulated crown plates, which the file described as hardened chitin secondary structures with no identified function, turned toward the door with a slowness that felt deliberate. And the viewport filled with amber gold, and I stood in the alcove corridor, looking through reinforced composite at a terminus-grade containment specimen, and it looked back at me. My heart was doing something loud and specific. I noted the time, 1442. I finished logging the delivery. I told it, into the corridor, not loudly, that maintenance had finally fixed the strip light in the alcove. This was a lie. Maintenance had not fixed it, but I had been composing a sentence to say if they ever did, because it seemed like a useful, neutral statement of fact that did not require a response, and I said it because I needed to say something, and that was the sentence I had. Then I went to the alcove and ate my second ration square of the shift. I checked the viewport camera feed on the alcove terminal before I left. The Vethrak had gone back to resting. Its eating schedule, from that week onward, was consistent, consuming the full delivery within the standard window, regularly, without gaps. I started clearing the viewport every shift. I started doing it at the beginning of the shift, and again at the close. Then I started doing it midway through as well, when I had nothing else to log and the corridor was quiet and I wanted something to pay attention to. The Vethrak did not always come to the viewport in the middle of the shift. Sometimes it was in the back of the pod, sometimes it was in the transit posture, the file described as the primary resting configuration, the 6 limbs folded, and the thorax low to the pod floor. But it came to the viewport when I delivered the tray, consistently. And when it came, it was the same. The slow turn of the head, the amber gold eyes at the viewport, the stillness that was not frozen, but easy. The board will have the behavioral science reports from this period. I have read them. They describe the K7 specimen as showing no significant behavioral change across the review quarter, with the exception of a noted regularization of feeding windows and an observed increase in proximity to the door during standard delivery hours. Assessor Torath's note in the margin of the quarterly report reads, possibly anticipatory feeding behavior tied to audio cue of pass-through mechanism. This is accurate as far as it goes. It does not go very far. What the reports do not describe, because no one from the behavioral science team was coming down to sublevel 9 with the frequency required to observe it, was this. By month 4, the Vethrak was at the door before I arrived. I know this because I had started watching the corridor camera feed on my wrist unit during the elevator descent, and I could see the pod camera, which showed the interior. The Vethrak would shift its position approximately 6 minutes before I reached the corridor. Not the delivery sound, I was nowhere near the corridor when it moved. Not the pass-through mechanism. The mechanism had not engaged. 6 minutes before I reached the corridor, when I was still in the elevator shaft, it moved. The file noted that the Vethrak's sensory array was classified as extreme range, with documented capacity for subsonic detection at significant distance. What distance was not specified, because no one had tested it in 91 years of custody. There was no reason to. The behavioral science team's explanation, when I mentioned the 6-minute positional shift to Assessor Torath, was that the specimen was probably responding to some consistent pre-arrival mechanical cue in the station's infrastructure, an air cycling change, a pressure differential in the sub-level systems, something the specimen had learned to associate with the delivery event. He said it calmly, with the authority of someone explaining something that had a reasonable explanation. I logged his explanation in the supplemental notes. What I did not log, because it felt like the kind of thing that would require a longer conversation than I was ready to have with the behavioral science team, was that I had been varying my elevator descent time specifically to test whether the 6-minute gap was fixed to a mechanical event or to me. I varied it by as much as 20 minutes across 6 consecutive shifts. The positional shift came at 6 minutes each time. By month 5, the resonance clicks had started. The file mentioned resonance clicks in passing in the section on ambient vocalization under non-communicative behavioral output. The original capture team's xenobiologist had spent 8 days attempting to establish whether the clicks constituted language, and concluded they did not, based on the absence of discernible pattern or response variation. The note read, "Vocalizations appear consistent across all observed states. No evidence of intentional modulation. Classify as ambient." The clicks I was hearing were not consistent across all observed states. They were different when I talked. Not dramatically, not in a way that would show up cleanly on an acoustic monitoring graph without someone specifically looking for it. But I had been on sub-level 9 for 5 months, and I knew the ambient register of Korath Wing the way you know a house you've lived in long enough, the specific sounds of its settling, the particular texture of its quiet, and the sound of something that was not settling. The clicks varied in pitch. They varied in response to what I said. When I talked about something I found interesting, my voice rose slightly, and the clicks rose slightly. When I was tired, my voice flattened, and the clicks flattened to a slower, softer register. When I laughed, which happened, sometimes, at something I was telling myself, the clicks shifted to a frequency I had no word for, something I could feel in the back of my throat more than hear, like standing close to machinery that is running well. I logged all of this. I logged it in the supplemental notes column, which had a character limit of 200, so I started keeping a secondary log in a personal document on my station unit. I want the board to understand that I was not withholding observations from the official record. I was supplementing it in the only format I had available that had enough space to describe what I was observing accurately. I labeled every entry with a shift date and time. The secondary log, as of the date of this hearing, is 418 pages long. The behavioral science team's Q6 report noted, ambient vocalizations continue. No significant pattern change observed. Recommend continuation of current delivery protocol. In month 6, it happened for the first time. I was late. Not my fault, Warden 2nd Grade Heron had stopped me in the upper corridor to review my access credentials for the 3rd time that week, a habit he had recently developed that I attributed to the new wing administrator's emphasis on what the administrator called procedural discipline, and what I privately described in my secondary log as finding things for bored people to do. By the time I reached sub-level 9, I was 14 minutes behind my standard schedule. The Vethrak was pressed against the inside of the K7 door. Not in a threatening configuration, I want to be precise about that, because the camera recording from that shift is in the evidence file, and I don't want the board to interpret it incorrectly. It was not in the posture the file described as a pre-strike configuration, which the original capture team had documented from the Valen incident with the care of people who had survived the incident and wanted to make sure no one else missed the signs. The pre-strike configuration involved specific positioning of the rear 2 limbs and a forward compression of the thorax toward the primary manipulation appendages. The posture I was looking at involved none of that. The Vethrak's thorax was against the composite, and the broad crown of its head was angled downward toward the door base toward the pass-through slot, and the amber gold eyes were at the viewport, but lower than usual. Lower than usual because the head was down. I stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at that. Then I logged into the delivery system, loaded the tray, slid it through, and said out loud and clearly into the corridor that I was sorry I was late, that Warden Heron's credential review process was the primary contributing factor, and that I had filed a formal note about the rechecks with a sub-level 9 administrative log because they were impeding standard delivery timing. The click that came back was long and low and felt like something pressing warmly against the base of my chest. It ate before I finished logging the delivery. It had never done that before. In 6 months of consistent delivery, it had always eaten after I left the corridor. It ate while I was standing at the door, logging the timestamp. I went back to the alcove and sat down and looked at the wall for a while. Then I opened the secondary log and wrote 4 pages. Month 8 was when I began to understand what the head lowering meant, or thought I did. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I am a nutrition officer and I am aware that my interpretations are not peer-reviewed science. I had been searching the xenobiological literature for Vethrak classified behavior patterns, and the literature was thin. Because there was only one Vethrak in compact custody, and the species had been classified as likely extinct in its native range following the garrison incident at Velen. There were academic papers on the capture itself, several on the containment engineering, one on the anatomical survey conducted under anesthesia during a health assessment in year 12 of custody, and a short paper from the xenobiologist who had been present at the original Velen observation post. Her paper was not about the killing. It was about what she had observed in the 3 minutes before the killing commenced, which was what she had been close enough to see before the garrison commander ordered her to the evacuation transport. She wrote, in the paper's 3rd section, "The specimen lowered its head in the direction of Commander Russell approximately 90 seconds before the containment breach. The posture was unlike anything in the behavioral record from the preceding observation period, which I had been maintaining for 14 days prior to the field operation. I have since reviewed every available record of analogous behavior in related chitin-plated insectoid species, and the closest comparable gesture I can identify is described in the literature on colonial insectoid predator taxonomy as acknowledgement. Display a posture used between specimens of equivalent recognized status to indicate recognition without aggression." I want to be clear that this comparison is speculative. The Vethrak is not a colonial species, and the behavioral context at Velen was radically different from any documented acknowledgement display context in the literature. I include the comparison only because it was the closest match I could find, and because it seemed worth recording that the display was directed specifically at Commander Russell, who had spent 14 days in observation rather than in the operational planning group, and who, in my assessment, had spent more direct observational time in proximity to the specimen than any other member of the Velen team. She added in a footnote, "It occurred to me, watching the display from the observation post, that the specimen was not greeting a threat or marking a handler. What it appeared to be doing in the 3 minutes before what happened next was acknowledging something it had not expected to find. Commander Russell had been among the 412. I don't know what that means about the head lowering, whether what the xenobiologist observed was what she thought she observed, or what might have happened if those 3 minutes had gone differently. I know what I observed for the 2.5 years that followed my reading of her paper, which was that the Vethrak lowered its head through the slot at the pass-through every time I reached the door. Not sometimes. Every time. The head came down when I arrived in the morning and again when I arrived in the evening. And the behavioral science team's 8 quarterly reports across that period described this consistently as feeding proximity posture with no identified social component. I kept my secondary log. I also kept thinking about the xenobiologist's footnote. I am not a scientist, and I am not making a scientific claim. But I spent 3 years watching something enormous and ancient lower its head in my direction twice a day, 12 hours apart. And I spent 3 years reading about how it had done this once before, for one other person, in a situation that ended very badly for most of the people present. I thought about that often, on the long, quiet stretches of a sub-level 9 shift, when the corridor was empty and the strip light flickered and the only sound was the distant infrastructure hum of the station. and whatever the Vethrak was doing behind its door. I thought, Commander Ressel went to the observation post for 14 days. He chose to pay attention. I thought, I'm here for 12 hours at a time, twice a day, and I talk. And the only reason I started talking was that I was alone, and the corridor was quiet. I thought, maybe attention is the thing. Maybe it was something very old, in a very quiet place, with no reason to notice anything in particular. Response to is simply being noticed back. I do not have a scientific framework for this. I have 418 pages of supplemental notes and 3 years of meal delivery logs and the memory of amber gold eyes at a viewport, steady and deep and present, in a way that made the specific quality of 12 hours on sublevel 9 different from any other 12 hours I have spent anywhere. I have the memory of a click frequency that I could feel in my chest more than hear when I said something that made me laugh. That is what I have. The board can determine what category it belongs in. By year 2, I had stopped being frightened. I want to be careful about how I say that, because I am not saying I had stopped understanding what the Vethrak was capable of. I had read the file many more times by that point. 412. 11 minutes and 40 seconds. The garrison at Velan had been a fully equipped military detachment, and they had not had 11 minutes and 40 seconds of real hope after the breach. I understood that clearly, and I did not minimize it. What I mean is that I had stopped carrying the fear of K7 inches the way that makes your shoulders tight and your attention fragmentary, because that kind of sustained dread is exhausting, and it was not. At 12 hours a day, doing anything useful. I had made a decision somewhere in the middle of my first year on sublevel 9 that fear of a specific thing is different from prudent awareness of that thing, and that what I felt when I walked down the corridor, the alertness, the attention, the sense of something that was paying close attention back, was closer to the latter than the former. The Vethrak knew my schedule better than the rotation calendar did. When I had a rest day and a relief officer covered a delivery, the Vethrak did not meet the door. The relief officer's logs noted no behavioral variation. The viewport recordings showed it resting in the back of the pod, not moving toward the door when the pass-through engaged, not clicking. Assessor Torras' note in the relief day logs read, possible that the variation in door approach behavior corresponds to variation in approach cadence, that is to say, the relief officer operates the pass-through mechanism at a different rate, producing a different mechanical cue. Recommend no protocol adjustment at this time. I added to my secondary log, or it knows who I am. Then I added, below that, I think it knows who I am. In year 2, there was a 6-day period when I was ill, and the relief rotation covered my shifts. I was running a fever for the first 4 days, and was genuinely not thinking about sublevel 9 for most of them, which I mention only because I think it is relevant that I was not, during those 6 days, doing anything deliberate. I was not maintaining some protocol or executing some strategy. I was in my billet with a fever, drinking warm broth, and watching old survey documentaries on my unit with the sound low because loud things were unpleasant. I was not thinking about the Vethrak at all. Or I was thinking about it only in the way you think about the ordinary elements of your routine when you're sick, and your routine has been interrupted with a mild, formless awareness of its absence. I did not read the behavioral log entries from those 6 days until I returned to duty. When I read them, I found that the Vethrak had not eaten on any of the 6 days. The relief officer had logged this as a behavioral anomaly on day 3. And flagged it to sublevel 6. Assessor Torath had reviewed the flag and responded, periodic non-eating is documented historical behavior. Continue standard protocol, log, and monitor. The relief officer had logged continued non-eating through day 6. When I returned on day 7 and came down the sub-level 9 elevator and walked the corridor and loaded the tray and slid it through the slot, it ate within the first 3 minutes of my logging the delivery. I was still at the door when it ate. I heard the mineral block move on the pod floor, which was a sound I had learned to identify in 3 years of delivery shifts, the specific scrape of it being handled. I logged the eating time. In the secondary log I wrote, 6 days is the longest I have been away. The file documents a previous non-eating event of 12 days in year 43, following the previous long-term delivery officer's retirement. I have no information about what the previous officer's relationship with K7 had been because the supplemental notes from that period are sparse and confined to nutritional data. I only know the dates, and that 12 days was the gap, and that eating resumed when a new officer was assigned. I know what I observed in the 6 days I was absent and the moment I returned. I am a Grade 2 nutrition officer, and I am not making a scientific claim. I logged it, and I continued my shifts, and I did not bring it up to the behavioral science team, because what would I say? The Vethrak didn't eat for 6 days while I was sick. That it started eating the moment I came back and was standing at the door? They will look at me the way Assessor Torath looked at me when I mentioned the 6-minute positional shift, not dismissively, because Torath was not a dismissive man, but with the careful expression of someone who needed a framework to put an observation into and did not currently have one that fit. The board has asked me to describe the specific incident that prompted this review. I will. I want to describe it accurately, which means describing the context accurately. Because without the context, what happened on day 11 of the Behavioral Reset Initiative reads as a containment anomaly, and it was not a containment anomaly. It was a recognition event. Director Keth Voss arrived at Forward Detention Station Solek in the 14th month of my Korath Wing assignment. He was the 3rd station director in my tenure on Sublevel 9, and the one who paid the most attention to K7, which I initially took as a positive sign. He reviewed the full behavioral science file in his first week, convened a meeting with the assessment team that I was not invited to, and issued a protocol update he called a Behavioral Reset Initiative. The rationale in the protocol document read, "Specimen has been in single handler delivery rotation for an extended period, creating conditions for potential behavioral dependency. To maintain institutional standards and ensure no irregular attachment behaviors have developed, a 3-week suspension of standard delivery personnel will be implemented, with warden rotation delivery maintained during the reset period." I submitted a formal objection the day I received the protocol notification. I noted in the objection that the behavioral science file did not support the existence of irregular attachment behaviors, that the file, as it currently stood, recorded no significant behavioral changes. I noted that the specimen's feeding consistency would be disrupted by a handler change, citing the 6-day non-eating incident from year 2. I noted that I had accumulated 3 years of supplemental observational data that I believed the director should review before implementing the protocol change, and I attached the first 40 pages of the secondary log as an exhibit. I asked for a meeting. Director Voss did not respond to the formal objection. 3 days later, I received a scheduling notification. Effective the following Monday, my sublevel 9 rotation was suspended pending the 3-week reset. The notification included a brief note from the director's administrative coordinator. Your formal objection has been logged and will be reviewed following the completion of the reset period. I went to Sublevel 9's administrative station and filed a secondary objection, citing Compact Welfare Division Protocol 7, subsection C, which provides nutrition officers the right to formally contest protocol changes affecting specimens in their long-term care rotation. Then I went to the corridor outside the behavioral science office and waited to speak with Assessor Torath, who had been the primary assessor on the K7 case for 4 years and who had, I felt, read more of my supplemental logs than anyone else on the science team. He came out of the office after 20 minutes. He read the secondary objection on his reader unit. Then he looked at me for a moment in the way that people look when they are about to say something they have already said to someone else and did not enjoy saying. He told me, quietly, that he had also submitted a formal concern to the director's office about the reset protocol and had received no response. He said, "I think the director wants to clean up what he's calling irregularities in the handling record." He said, "I think the relationship you've documented in the supplemental notes represents something that makes the people who fund this station uncomfortable." I asked him what kind of uncomfortable. He paused for a moment, the distracted look he got when he was choosing words carefully. "The kind," he said, "where a terminus-grade classified containment specimen and a Grade 2 nutrition officer appear to understand each other. The kind that raises questions the current classification framework doesn't have answers to. And when institutions don't have answers," he said, "they prefer to remove the question rather than answer it." I thanked him. I went back to Sublevel 9 for my last shift before the reset began. I stood at the K7 door for longer than I usually did. The Vethrak was at the slot. It had been at the slot since I stepped off the elevator. I had seen it on the wrist unit feed, and it was still there, head low, amber gold eyes at the viewport. The clicks were soft and steady, the register I had come to associate with the long, flat middle hours of a quiet shift. I told it that I was going to be away for 3 weeks and that someone else would bring the trays and that I would be back. I do not know what any of that translates into, whether any of it reaches through 2 meters of acoustic dampening composite in any form that means something. I included it in the secondary log. I loaded the tray. I slid it through the pass-through. It ate while I was still at the door. I left. The first week of the reset, the behavioral science corridor cameras showed the Vethrak not eating. The warden delivery team logged this. By day 5, Assessor Torath submitted an urgent note to Director Voss. Specimen is refusing delivery from non-standard personnel. Recommend evaluation of reset protocol timeline given feeding refusal history. Director Voss responded, "Non-eating is a documented historical behavior. Continue reset protocol as planned. Log and monitor." On day 8, the warden delivering the morning tray reported that the Vethrak had moved to the door while he was in the corridor. Not the pre-strike configuration, but close to the door, head angled toward the pass-through. The warden filed a threat proximity alert and requested a 2-man delivery team. Director Voss approved the request and added a note to the protocol record: specimen behavior within expected parameters for a behavioral disruption event. Reset proceeding as planned. On day 11, I was in the upper corridor administrative area, filing the 3rd section of my secondary objection. The administrative area is at the junction of the upper block corridor and the Korath wing staging corridor, which is the approach corridor to the sub-level elevators. The staging corridor connects to sub-level 9 at its lower end, but at its upper end, where the administrative station is, it is a standard service corridor, composite walls, overhead lighting, a row of equipment lockers. I was at the terminal working through the protocol citation when I heard boots on the corridor floor behind me. Warden Advocate Seld Morn was the senior warden advocate on sub-level 9. He was responsible for corridor compliance and disciplinary enforcement among the detention staff, which in practice meant he was the person who delivered formal warnings and escalating corrective actions to staff who were not following procedure. I had been aware of him since early in my Korath Wing tenure. He had made it clear, on several occasions over the course of 3 years, that he found my supplemental logging practice irregular, my habit of talking to the K7 specimen unprofessional, and my formal objection filings disruptive to institutional process. He was not wrong that I was being disruptive. I was aware of that. I was also aware that Protocol 7 subsection C exists specifically because there are situations in which disruption is the appropriate response. He stopped behind me and said, "Your secondary objection has been flagged for procedural interference. Director Voss has requested that you cease formal filing until the reset period is concluded." I said, "I have the right to file formal objections under Compact Welfare Division Protocol 7, subsection C. I am exercising that right, and I intend to continue exercising it." He raised the compliance baton. He did not swing it. The board has access to the staging corridor camera record from that moment, and I would ask them to review it carefully. He raised the baton to a compliance-ready warning position, which is the first stage posture in the Warden Advocate Enforcement Protocol, a signal, not an active strike, intended to indicate to a non-compliant staff member that the next stage of enforcement is available. It is a warning posture. He raised it, and I took a step back. What happened next took 11 seconds. The behavioral science monitoring system for K7 at 1432 hours and 17 seconds on day 11 of the Behavioral Reset Initiative recorded a resonance click vocalization of a frequency that the monitoring system had no designation for. Not low register ambient, not the arrival frequency, not the frequency from that morning 14 months ago when I was late because of Warden Heron's credential review, a frequency the monitoring system had never encountered in 91 years of documented custody and had never been calibrated to expect, and therefore flagged automatically as a sensor anomaly and queued for review. Assessor Torath, who happened to be at his station on sublevel 6 reviewing the Day 8 feeding refusal log, had his ambient monitoring feed open during duty hours. He heard it. He has submitted his own account to this board, so I will not speak to his experience of the next 11 seconds. I will speak to mine. The containment protocol for K7, established in the original engineering report and reviewed by every successive assessment team across 91 years, was built on 3 assumptions. The first was that the laminated composite door was impenetrable by the specimen under normal conditions. The second was that the reinforced pass-through slot, being sized for tray delivery only, with a gap height of 12 centimeters, represented no meaningful egress or access point. The third was that the structural tolerances of the slot housing had been tested to significantly exceed any force the specimen was capable of exerting through a 12-centimeter gap. The engineering team had not, in 91 years, tested what the containment system would withstand from a specimen producing a behavioral state they had no record of, and therefore no parameter to test against. In 11 seconds, the pass-through slot was large enough that the forward limb of the Vethrak was in the staging corridor. The limb was not at me. I need to be precise about this. The forward limb extended into the corridor in a single smooth motion, curved once. At the primary joint, the joint documented in the anatomy survey, as capable of 140 degrees of independent articulation in the direction of Warden Advocate Morn. The terminal claw, which the file described as a secondary restraint-capable appendage, made contact with the compliance baton, just the baton. The baton left Morn's hand. It crossed the corridor in a single arc and came to rest against the far wall beside the equipment lockers. Then, the limb withdrew through the enlarged slot. The click that followed was long and low and warm in a register I recognized. The slot was not the same dimensions it had been 11 seconds before. There was visible deformation in the housing frame. The slot was measurably wider. The board's engineering assessors have measured the deformation, and the report is in the evidence file. Morn was against the far wall. He had not been touched. He was looking at the K7 door, not the staging corridor door. The sub-level K7 door itself was one floor down. But somehow, in the way that people reorient their awareness when something has crossed the boundary they had believed was fixed, he was looking in the direction of it. His face had the expression I had spent 3 years developing the vocabulary to describe. I still don't have the right word for it. Not fear exactly. Closer to the specific blankness of someone whose categories have just been revised. I said, "I think you should leave the corridor." He left. I stood in the staging corridor for a moment after he was gone. The baton was still against the far wall. The overhead lighting hummed. Somewhere down in the sub-level, the K7 monitoring system's ambient feed was recording a steady soft clicking in a register I recognized as the long, flat quiet of a shift going normally. The compact review board convened 6 days later. Assessor Toreth had filed a formal emergency override of the Behavioral Reset Initiative under Compact Wildlife Provisions, Article 9, citing active behavioral crisis in a classified containment specimen as grounds for immediate protocol suspension. Director Voss had countermanded the override under Operational Mandate 12. The dispute had escalated to board level, which is why I am here now, speaking into a recording unit in a room that smells of recycled air and the specific kind of institutional cleaning solution that every compact facility uses, describing 3 years of meal trays and supplemental notes to people who are looking at me with the particular attention of people who are not sure what category to put me in. I understand the difficulty. I am a Grade 2 nutrition officer. I have no behavioral science credentials. My supplemental notes are not a formal research document. They are personal observations logged in a secondary file, because the official record didn't have space for what I was seeing. The behavioral science team was working with the data the monitoring system was designed to capture, and the monitoring system was designed by people who had spent 91 years believing that the K7 specimen was doing nothing communicative and recognizing no individual. They were not wrong to believe that on the available data. The available data supported that reading. But the available data was the data the system was designed to capture. And the system was not designed to capture what I was observing. It was designed to capture a terminus-grade classified containment threat that did not eat sometimes and clicked ambientally and maintained position in the rear of its pod. Those were the parameters. The parameters fit the behavior they were designed to monitor. Nothing else was coming through. I want to say something clearly for the record, because I think it matters, and I am not sure the behavioral science team's preliminary analysis captures it. I think for 91 years, the Vethrak was in that pod, and the people who came down the corridor were not particularly interesting to it, not threatening, not significant. They did what they did, and it was or was not hungry, and the years went by in the way that time goes by for something very old in a very quiet place. The behavioral record reads the way it reads because the record was accurate. Nothing communicative was happening. No one was being recognized. That is not a failure of the 11 behavioral science teams. That is what was true. Then, a scheduling coordinator who didn't read the wing designation carefully posted an open slot, and I applied because the upper block smelled of solvent. It is not a small thing being recognized. I don't know if the board has much experience with the specific weight of it, the experience of something very old that has had no reason to pay attention to anything in a very long time, turning its attention toward you. I know that I've had 3 years of experience with it, and I know that it changed the quality of 12 hours on sub-level 9 in a way I did not expect and still find difficult to fully describe. What I can say is that what I felt walking down that corridor every shift was not indifference, and it was not fear. It was something like what you feel when you are known, when something that is paying very close attention has decided to pay very close attention specifically to you. I read the xenobiologist's paper again the night before this hearing. The footnote, the part about what she thought the head lowering might have meant in the 3 minutes at Velan before things went wrong. It occurred to me, she wrote, that the specimen was not greeting a threat or marking a handler. What it appeared to be doing was acknowledging something it had not expected to find. I do not know what Commander Russell did in the 14 days at the observation post that made the Vethrak lower its head toward him. I know what I did for 3 years, which was slide a tray through a slot twice a day and talk to myself in a quiet corridor. Because I was alone, and talking is what I do when I'm alone in a quiet place. Maybe that's the whole of it. Maybe the whole of it is that I was there, and I was consistent, and I was not afraid, and something very old decided that was enough. Director Voss has been placed on an administrative leave pending review of the Behavioral Reset Initiative authorization. Warden Advocate Morn has filed for reassignment to an upper block post which has been provisionally approved. I have been told that his compliance baton was retrieved from the staging corridor wall by a maintenance crew member who filed an incident report noting that the baton housing was cracked and requesting a replacement. The report did not include an explanation for the damage. I do not think the maintenance crew member wanted to write an explanation. Assessor Torath has submitted a formal request to this board to have my secondary log classified as primary observational data and incorporated into the official K7 behavioral file. The behavioral science team's preliminary analysis, circulated internally before this hearing, describes the Day 11 event as follows. The specimen's response to the perceived threat against the delivery officer indicates a level of individual recognition and protective behavioral orientation not previously documented in the species record or in the 91-year custody file. The nature of this orientation, its implications for the specimen's communicative capacity, and the appropriate framework for understanding the relationship between the specimen and the delivery officer remain subjects for further study. They used the word relationship. The behavioral science team, who spent 4 years logging ambient vocalizations and feeding proximity postures with no identified social component, wrote the word relationship in their preliminary analysis. I logged it in my secondary log and noted 4 years and 400 pages later. The board has asked me, in the preliminary questionnaire, what I believe should happen to the K7 specimen going forward. It is not a question a Grade 2 nutrition officer is typically asked. I am going to answer it. I think it should have someone who talks to it, someone who comes at the same time, with the same tray, and stands at the viewport long enough to notice when the clicks change register. Someone who is not afraid to be there, not because they don't understand the file. They should understand the file. All 340 pages, including the part about 11 minutes and 40 seconds. But because they've decided that fear is not a productive use of a 12-hour shift, and have made their peace with that decision, the way I made mine in the first week, I am available for that assignment. I know the board will want to address the structural implications of what happened in the staging corridor. I know the engineering team's full review of the K7 containment system is a priority, and I support it. I want the system to be sound. I want the door to work. That is not inconsistent with what I also want, which is to slide the tray through the slot on a Tuesday afternoon and hear the clicks shift upward when I start talking, and see the amber gold eyes at the viewport, and tell it about my sister, and the documentary I watched on my rest day, and the fact that maintenance still, I cannot stress this enough, has not fixed the strip light in the alcove. When I walked back down the sub-level 9 corridor, the morning after the board's provisional suspension of the behavioral reset initiative, the strip light was still flickering. Maintenance had left a note that they'd be back next week. The corridor smelled the way it always smelled, filtered air, and the specific plasticity of industrial composite, and the faint mineral undertone I had eventually realized was not the composite at all, but came from the far end of the corridor. I loaded the tray: protein slurry, mineral block, treated water. The Vethrak was at the door before I reached the corridor junction. 6 minutes out, same as always. Whatever adheres or senses in the infrastructure of the station that tells it, I am coming. I have spent 3 years logging hypotheses in my secondary file and have not arrived at a conclusion it knows. I walked the corridor. I talked. I told it about the preliminary board hearing, about the provisional suspension, about Assessor Torath's request to incorporate the secondary log. I told it the board seemed genuinely uncertain what to do with me, which I found understandable because I was a Grade 2 nutrition officer and none of the existing categories covered what I apparently was. I told it that maintenance still hadn't fixed a strip light, which remained a civic failure of the highest order, and that I had started keeping a running tally of repair request response times. The clicks were soft and steady. When I reached the door and cleared the viewport, the head came down. Low, steady, amber gold eyes level. The way it had come down on day 6, on the first late shift, on every delivery for 3 years. The way the xenobiologist had watched it come down in a different corridor, in a different place, 91 years ago. In 3 minutes, that did not go well for anyone. It ate before I finished logging the delivery. I stood in the corridor for an extra few minutes after, not because I needed to, just because I was there. And it was there. And the corridor was quiet the way it always was on sublevel 9, and the clicks were the steady ambient register of something enormous and very old, resting in the presence of one person who had decided, a long time ago, and entirely by accident, that fear was not worth 12 hours of her energy. The board will make its decision. The engineering review will proceed. The behavioral science team will write their papers and determine what category to put 418 pages of supplemental notes into. All of that is appropriate and I support it. But I want to be on record about one thing, separate from the formal recommendation I submitted, separate from the secondary log and the incident account and the question of whether my objection filings were within my rights under Protocol 7. For 3 years, I walked down that corridor twice a day and slid a tray through a slot in a door that opened into the pod of a creature that had ended 412 lives in under 12 minutes. And I talked, because I was alone and talking is what I do when I'm alone. And something that the behavioral science file said was incapable of individual recognition learned the sound of my particular footstep in the elevator shaft at 6 minutes distance and was at the door when I arrived, every time I arrived, and lowered its head the way a xenobiologist had observed it lower its head once before, 91 years ago, toward a man who had chosen to spend his time at the observation post rather than in the planning room. That is not nothing. The head was down when I reached the door this morning. The clicks were soft. The tray went through the slot, and the amber gold eyes were at the viewport, and the corridor was quiet, and the strip light was flickering, same as it always was. That is the whole of my testimony. I am available for further questions, and I am available for the K7 rotation at whatever grade the board determines is appropriate, starting Monday if the provisional suspension holds. Thank you.